Well, hello. 20 minutes on conflict. Welcome to this webinar this evening. And if you're watching this on YouTube later on as a recording, I'll give you some more information on how to send me questions that way. For now, if you're watching this live and you want to send me a question relating to conflict or anything I mention in this next 20 minutes or so, then please use the chat box at the bottom right hand side of the screen, I believe, it certainly is on mine. And just send me a question. I'll check from time to time over here, and hopefully I get a little bit of feedback that way. Wherever you are, I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Now, conflict, I've been working with conflict for over 30 years now. I'm a workplace mediator, among other things. I've taught conflict resolution skills at the University of London and elsewhere, and I've been running workshops on conflict internationally for a similar amount of time. I've got a good deal to say about it. I'm going to distill that down for the next 20 minutes or so. I put more into my courses, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the show here. Thing about conflict is it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. If you're in a relationship, if you're a human being, you're going to have conflict in your life. We can't avoid it, however much we might like to try. And so you might as well learn how to handle it constructively. And indeed, people who handle conflict well actually get less of it in their lives, paradoxically. So, because they're better at heading it off, they're better at avoiding it, and they're better at preventing it. Now, to some extent, we're all good at that. We are a social species, and as a social species, we rub along pretty well together. I know there are wars and conflicts all over the place, divorces and arguments and this, that, and the other, and the news is full of that every day. But the bottom line is really you have dozens, if not hundreds, of interactions on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, and most of them go off without hitch. Most of them go off very, very smoothly. And that's because we're skilled at handling relationships, we're skilled at avoiding conflict, at smoothing feathers, at generally repairing our mistakes that we might make accidentally in conversations and so forth. Now and again it goes wrong. I mean, statistically speaking, it's a relatively small number of times compared with the vast number of interactions we have that function very well, thank you very much. But that now and again they do go wrong, and they're the ones we remember. And sadly, we tend to make them much worse than they need be. And that's really been part of my mission for a long time now. I'm not holding my breath, I have to say, because human beings seem to be very slow learners with regard to conflict. We do have the technology, folks. We do know how to avoid conflict, how to damp it down. And well, as you'll see in this brief talk, there's a lot we can do. And we're only really scratching the surface here in this webinar. So it's a normal part of human relationships, and it's going to happen. So you might as well get used to it and get good, get effective, learn how to handle it. I'm going to talk about what conflict is and what it isn't, by the way, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. I'm going to give you 3 reasons we can get stuck into conflict. It's all the threes tonight. I'm going to tell you 3 things you can do to help prepare yourself, make yourself more robust and function better, possibly avoiding conflict or having less conflict in your life. But if it does arise, you'll be in a better place, in a better position to deal with it in what I'd call a responsible and adult manner. And then thirdly, I'm going to tell you about 3 things that you can do if you're actually engaged in a conflict or an argument and you want to stop it. And of course, it only takes 1 to stop an argument, folks. We know that. It takes 2 to start one. It only takes 1 to stop it at any given time. And I know there are all those reasons, all those excuses come up. Ah, yes, but the other person. Yeah, well, that's part of the problem, isn't it? And I shall be touching on that as we go through this talk. I'm not sure what area your interest is in conflict. I mean, if whether you're talking about personal relationships, you're thinking about workplace relationships, you may be engaged in a particular conflict with a neighbor, friend, colleague, spouse, ex-spouse. you may need some pointers, some guidelines on how to deal with that. And there is a lot more, by the way, on my YouTube channel, and it's all free. You can find quite a few videos there on this topic, because over the years I've made a fair number of recordings and training courses on how to deal with this subject. So what is conflict? Well, conflict arises out of difference, a difference of perceptions, different needs, different wishes, sets of wishes, different beliefs, and even beliefs and perceptions that are completely unfounded very often, sadly. Arguments, fights, wars, battles, all the stuff we think about as conflict are in fact responses to conflict. They're the physical manifestations of an earlier disagreement or an earlier threat going on between two or more people. So the conflict is actually at the root of what we call conflict. And what we call conflict is actually what we see and experience, which is the fights, the arguments, the disagreements, the tears, the sense of loss, the sense of feeling misunderstood, and so on and so forth. So let's get that clear from the outset, that conflict is actually born out of difference. But difference and disagreement doesn't have to mean division. That's a really important factor. And one of the things that I will be talking about later is the fact that acceptance, although it's a slightly hackneyed word and not terribly fashionable these days, acceptance is really what it's all about as a starting point, because two people are perfectly able to have differing opinions without having a fight about it. So when it does cause a fight, why not step back and simply allow both sides to have their different opinions and work differently towards some sort of solution or some sort of coexistence or whatever is required for harmony to exist? There's also a presupposition that the natural state of things is harmony. So when conflict arises, it's quite often seen as dysfunctional. Now, I don't agree with this, because it's just going to happen anyway. And of course, conflict can become crippling and very, very serious in its ramifications. But it isn't in and of itself harmful. It's how we handle it or mishandle it that makes conflict so damaging. And that's quite obvious if you've ever been through one of those protracted business or marital battles that people get involved with when they're separating from a partner in some area of their lives. So how we handle those differences determines really how we experience conflict. And a conflict doesn't have to mean a fight, but unfortunately, sadly, it often does. One of the things that I've been asking students, my students, when I've been teaching conflict resolution as a routine part of the courses and workshops that I've run over the years, I always start by asking them, what do you mean by the word conflict? When you hear the word conflict, what is the image that it conjures up for you? What is the vision that it brings to mind? Another way of asking this question is to say, if the word conflict didn't exist, what would you replace it with to describe what you think conflict means? And universally, I would say, there's maybe a very small percentage, 0.01% or something, of people come up with something different. But generally, we get the flip chart out and we wind up with this list of topics that you'd expect, with words that you'd expect: fights and anger and frustration and division and wars and all the rest. Now, by the way, I leave wars out of this for the purpose of this talk, because they really have their political manifestations of difference, and there are all sorts of other things that cause wars. So it's not really fair, although they get called conflicts, in the sense that I'm speaking about conflict here now, that's not really appropriate. So how we handle the differences determines how we experience a conflict or not. And what we typically call conflict is therefore just really a symptom of those differences being bashed out in some way, and usually not very successfully. Excuse me, hit the microphone there. So why do we get stuck in conflict? You know those patterns? They're almost predictable in many cases. And in fact, it's interesting that if you look at the marital research, the 6 or 7 things that married couples or long term partners most often argue about are across the board pretty common factors, and they're not terribly exotic. It's things like money and sex and housework and division of labour, in other words, child rearing, and so on and so forth. And of course, these only become arguments and disagreements because the two partners have different views on the same topic. So we might disagree about how to raise children. We might disagree about what's a fair amount of housework, and so forth. Well, it's pretty well inevitable that that's going to happen, isn't it? You can't have harmony on every point. It'd be pretty boring if you did. And one of the things that couples can usefully do early on in their relationship, and by the way, successful couples do this over time, research has shown, by hit and miss more or less, but it doesn't do any harm to actually sit down and discuss one's differences and anticipate where the obstacles, the flashpoints, the hotspots could come, because then they won't take you by surprise when they do crop up. And by the way, some things it's perfectly feasible to negotiate. For example, should the children finish their meal, or are they free to leave the table when they've finished eating? Or should they wait whether they finish their meal or not? Table manners, these types of things, these often cause arguments between parents, and yet parents can agree on what they jointly think is the right way to go about it, and possibly, and very often, they will have to fashion some midway point, some new way. They may not do it the way their parents did it. They may do it the way this new family does it. So these things are always up for grabs and are always negotiable, but they go wrong because we go wrong with them because so often they take us by surprise because we haven't thought forward and thought, well, how are we going to deal with this? I think one of the reasons for that is that when people are getting along just fine and when everything's harmonious and going swimmingly, of course, we don't want to raise the sore topics, the hot topics, the topics that might cause difficulties later. But that is precisely the time to discuss them. Because if we discuss them when we're tense, tired, angry, frustrated, we all know what happens. So why do we get stuck in conflict? What are the 3 reasons I'm going to talk about tonight? And of course, there are many more, but obviously emotions play quite a big part in this. But I'll start with a perception of threat. Now, threat might sound like a big word, but it can be a threat to my self-esteem, it can be a threat to my ideas, it can be a threat to my position in an organization, my position in the family. It can be all sorts of things. But underlying anger, frustration, fighting back is very often a defensive mechanism of some sort. And underlying that very often is insecurity or fear. So this is where our emotions overtake us. And once it becomes an emotional battle, as you know, it becomes pretty hard to resolve or to cool down. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment or two. There's a third factor which helps to keep conflict alive between people, and that is the stories. It's the meaning that we give to the conflict. Now, you see this in history that some nations, cultures, groups, tribes, they manage to keep a story alive for several generations to keep the potential for conflict going, to keep the tribe or the group or the nation on a constant state of alert, just in case the problem flares up again. Not very helpful. But on a personal level, on an individual level, it's equally possible to have a story that you make up, and we all do it all the time. And the typical story would be, well, the other person's to blame. They're not listening to me. They're not interested in a solution. These are all stories because, of course, we haven't checked with them whether they're interested in a solution. We've probably shouted something like that at them. We may well have done, but we haven't had what I call a reasoned adult conversation about it. So in order to address the potential for ourselves contributing to conflict more than we should or more than we could, I think we need to be able to gain mastery over our emotions. We need to be able to step back. That's quite obvious. we need to be able to recognize the difference between a real threat when we need to be defensive and something that our mind is conjuring, a perceived threat. And we need to be honest with ourselves. This is where emotional intelligence comes in, self awareness, self knowledge, having mastery over one's emotions. That whole cluster of skills that go under the heading of emotional intelligence really are vital in the responsible and mature handling of potential conflict in one's life. And then, thirdly, in this little cluster of points I'm talking about here, is this idea that we make up a story, we believe the story, we keep the story alive, and the story usually shows us as the victim and the other person as the villain, or some form of dynamic like that. And of course, it's very hard to move past a conflict once that story is instilled in our minds, and once we carry that around with us. So those are the three things, and I think it's within our power, all of us, to review those things. Of course, it's a tough one sometimes. It can be hard to put down your closely held beliefs and your stories that you've told yourself to protect yourself and make the other person wrong. But it's a starting point to a more, what I call, a more mature, a more evolved, a more developed approach to handling conflict. So the three things one can do is to know about one's own motives. I mentioned emotional intelligence, that's clearly a factor here. It's very important to accept that different points of view exist in the world. Different points of view exist, and everybody is entitled to their own point of view. An opinion cannot kill, an opinion cannot harm us, and yet we seem to be on a mission sometimes to push our own agenda and crush somebody else's opinion. Perhaps that's rather strong language, but you've only got to think of how vehement an argument can become, and you'll see what I mean. The aim of an individual becoming better at handling conflict is to be able to aim for adopting a collaborative stance with the other person or people. This is a proactive position where if I'm moving into a disagreement with somebody else, my effort should go into understanding their point of view and working collaboratively with them. And later on, having them understand my point of view, of course, rather than the other way around. So build a stepping stone, build a platform, build a window into their world through listening, through collaborating, through seeking to understand. Always seek to understand, rule number one. And from that position, you may curry a little favour with them, calm things down a little, and at that point, you can then put your case forward as well. Two people can work collaboratively to resolve a conflict. It's very hard for one person to do it. But what one person can do is make the first move, make a gesture, listen, pay attention to the other person, and put the effort into understanding them rather than forcing our own agenda. I'm not here to say it's easy, folks. I mean, sometimes people really don't like these points. They think, well, they'd rather go on blaming and continue to battle with other people as they have done before. But these are what the guidebooks say, folks. These are what the experts on conflict resolution recommend that we do. This and far more. If you want to break into a conflict cycle, in other words, interrupt an argument, stop a fight, and I'm not talking about a physical fight, personal safety is very important here, but if it's your argument that you are involved with, I'm not talking now about intervening between two other people, that's a whole other ball game, and I'm not covering that here in this short webinar. First thing in order to break a conflict cycle is to really put your shield and spear down, is to step back, take a breath, listen, pay attention to the other person. They need to hear that you are hearing them. They need to understand that. One way to do that is to summarize your understanding of their point. Listen for what their needs are. Never mind what they're saying they want. That's a position. But what do you think the underlying needs are? You could ask them that. Okay, I understand your position. You want more money, or you won't give up this piece of land, whatever it has to be. I understand your position. Tell me what makes that position necessary for you. What's the need underlying the position? Maybe we can find a way around it and work around it together. In those conversations, when there has been an argument or when there's a tendency towards arguing and disputation, then report rather than dominate. Report on how you're feeling, what you're experiencing, what your needs are, rather than trying to impose your point of view on the other person or trying to get them to change their mind or change them in any way. One thing is sure, any time you try and change somebody else, folks, you're going to lose. And finally, look for shared interests. Build some sort of collaborative stance so that together you can discuss shared interests and work to have those interests, those needs met, rather than expending the energy in a fight. Now that brings me to the end of this. I'm quite conscious of time because I've been known to go way over. I try and keep these within 20 minutes. I hope it's given you a few pointers, a few indicators, a few ideas. Remember, there's a lot more on my YouTube page at Barry Wimbolt. That's a search for me on YouTube, or on my blog at www.barrywinbolt.com. You can also send me comments either via YouTube or the blog if you have any questions following this or any questions on this topic. So that's all from me for now. Thank you very much. I'll see you same place, same time next week with a new topic. Goodbye.